what I hope to do today, this is your day. I'm going to be flexible, but the general plan is to open up, review the agenda. That's what we're doing now. We're going to have this introductory exercise on the preamble. Now we're going to spend some time looking at Article 3, the principles of the convention. Okay, I was given very specific instructions by our CODO leaders to spend some time on the principles. You need to embrace those principles, learn them. Sharda will probably test you on them. Okay, fair warning, all right? So we have a job to do there. We'll have a little break, and then we'll continue with some exercises, digging a little deeper into the treaty. And in the afternoon, again, we're going to complete our overview, and then we're going to talk and consider about how to use these tools in the implementation process, okay? In a more, practical level, right? How does this really matter? Then we'll close. Any questions about our day? The agenda? Okay. And I'll continue to introduce you to some materials. I certainly will say a little bit more about the Human Rights Yes manual that you have now. Okay, I'll explain a little bit about the structure, how that manual is used, and you all should be very proud because I think the disability community here has done an amazing job of utilizing the participatory approach to human rights education around the CRPD. At one point, Sharda pulled together an entire week-long, extremely intensive training going through every single chapter in that book. I mean, this is, big stars for Trinidad, because I'm not sure that that's been done anywhere else where I've worked. Usually we'll, select bits and pieces. But I think that was really a pretty neat, pretty impressive. So it's a resource that you can use not only to gain more knowledge of different issue areas, right, covered in the treaty, but it's also a resource that has all sorts of exercises, some of which we did yesterday, as I indicated, participatory exercises that you can use in a range of different settings. So I've used some of these exercises with, high-level officials, with very grassroots civil society organizations, and kind of every other kind of actor in between. And it's, meant to be taken and adapted, make up your own exercises and so on. The other thing we're going to do throughout the day is we're going to build a wall of disability rights. And it's going to be the biggest, best wall. It's not going to be paid for by the Mexicans, okay? No, it's not. It's going to be way better, bigger, and stronger than Donald Trump's wildest dreams, okay? So we're going to build that wall. Okay, and we are going to start, like I said, with the preamble. So please open up, make sure you're using a copy of the preamble, and we will start with A, and we will end with Y. That might mean that we come back to this table at the very end, because I don't know if we have, 25 people in the room quite yet. So we'll start with this table. You, the last person reading here, will hand it to this table, then you'll hand it to this table, then you'll hand it to this table, then you'll bring it back. Okay, and here's what I want, and this is a serious exercise, okay? And I truly believe this. I truly believe that if you read the preamble, think about it, internalize it, understand it, that's all you need to know. It's all there. We'll have a conversation about that. So please read out each paragraph with intention, discernment, slowly, so that we can all, kind of reflect on each paragraph. Each paragraph has meaning. And I know this because I have just finished it's probably about a 40-page, single-spaced book chapter on this preamble. Okay? Man, I've been living with it, and it is awesome. And, and I look at it, I'm like, wow, I didn't remember this was in the preamble. So it is special. I am obsessed with treaty preambles now. Really, I am. Okay. So I'm going to start off. Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, 13 December 2006, entered into force 3 May 2008. Preamble. The states parties to the present convention,
recalling the principles proclaimed in the Charter of the United Nations, which recognize the inherent dignity and worth and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world.
B, recognizing that the United Nations, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenants on Human Rights, has proclaimed and agreed that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth therein, without distinction of any kind.
Reaffirming the universality, indivisibility, interdependence, and interrelatedness of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the need for persons with disabilities to be guaranteed their full enjoyment without discrimination.
Recalling the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Convention against torture, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and members of their families.
Recognizing that disability is an evolving concept and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others.
F, recognizing the importance of the principles and policy guidelines contained in the World Programme of Action concerning disabled persons and in the standard rules on the equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities in influencing the promotion, formulation, and evaluation of the policies, plans, programs, and actions at the national, regional, and international levels to further equalize opportunities for persons with disabilities.
G, emphasizing the importance of mainstreaming disability issues as an integral part of relevant strategies of sustainable development.
Recognizing also that discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity and worth of the human person.
Recognizing further the diversity of persons with disabilities.
J. Recognizing the need to promote and protect the human rights of all persons with disabilities, including those who require more intensive support.
K. Concern that despite these various instruments and undertakings, persons with disabilities continue to face barriers in their participation as equal members of society and violations of their human rights in all parts of the world.
L. Recognizing the importance of international cooperation for improving the living conditions of persons with disabilities in every country, particularly in developing countries.
And recognizing the importance of persons with disabilities of their individual autonomy and independence, including the freedom to make their own choices.
M. Recognizing the valued existing and potential contributions made by persons with disability to the overall well-being and diversity of their communities, and that the promotion of the full enjoyment of persons with disability, of their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and of all participation by persons with disability will result in their enhanced sense of belonging and in significant advances in the human, social, and economic development of society and the eradication of poverty. Considering that persons with disability should have the opportunity to be actively involved in decision-making processes about policies and programs, including those directly concerning them. P. Concerned about difficult conditions faced by persons with disabilities who are subject to multiple or aggravated forms of discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or any other opinion, national, ethnic, indigenous, or social origin, property, birth, age, or other status.
Q, recognizing that women and girls with disabilities are often at greater risk, both within and outside the home of violence, injury or abuse, neglect, or negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation.
Recognizing that children with disabilities should have full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with other children, and recalling obligations to that end undertaken by states parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
S. Emphasizing the need to incorporate a gender perspective in all efforts to promote the full enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms by persons with disabilities.
T, highlighting the fact that the majority of persons with disabilities live in conditions of poverty, and in this regard, recognizing the critical need to address the negative impact of poverty on persons with disabilities.
Bearing in mind that conditions of peace and security based on full respect for the purpose and principles contained in the Charter of the United Nations and observance of applicable human rights, instruments are indispensable for the full protection of persons with disabilities, in particular during armed conflicts and foreign occupation.
Recognizing the importance of accessibility to the physical, social, economic, and cultural environment, to health and education, and to information and communication, in enabling persons with disabilities to fully enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms.
W, realizing that the individual, having duties to other individuals and to the community to which he or she belongs, is under a responsibility to strive for the promotion and observance of the rights recognized in the International Bill of Human Rights.
X, convinced that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state, and that persons with disabilities and their family members should receive the necessary protection and assistance to enable families to contribute towards the full and equal enjoyment of the rights of the persons with disability.
Convinced that a comprehensive and integral international convention to promote and protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities will make a significant contribution to redressing the profound social disadvantage of persons with disabilities and to promote their participation in the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural spheres with equal opportunities in both developing and developed countries.
And then everyone together will read Article 1. Having agreed as follows, Article 1, purpose. The purpose of the present convention is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Our workshop is officially opened and convened. Comments? We're building our wall. We went through the whole preamble. Yes. And
After us reading the preamble, I feel a sense of sadness because we needed this to recognize persons with disabilities as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That without this, people would take advantage of them,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel a sense of sadness that we actually needed this in order to recognize them as human beings that require the same level of respect and dignity. And it tells me something about the human nature that is not very nice at all.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do appreciate having this because I understand how this then protects them and how it is applied to them to give them that level of rights and respect to be heard, to live, to enjoy life, as the case may be, and it also empowers us to provide and give them what they need, and we can hold other people in authority accountable to help us and to provide for their citizens what is required.
Yeah, and that's a really profound point because as this preamble shows, we already have other, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we've got the UN Charter that has a little bit of human rights sprinkled in it. We have these other conventions that apply to all people, all human beings. So exactly, why on earth do you need a special, specific document to do this? And that is the way the human rights framework has developed, right? We needed a treaty specifically on racial discrimination. We needed a treaty specifically addressing the rights of women, the rights of children, migrant workers. And we had a conversation during the drafting of the treaty because there were those who said, is this even the right thing to do? We're going to create a separate treaty on disability rights. It's, you know, ultimately we came up with the answer that we did need this to elevate, amplify, and highlight not just that persons with disabilities are human beings and have human rights as all others, but also to give some more specific guidance. Because there's a lot of concepts in this treaty that are not reflected in other treaties. Accessibility, reasonable accommodation, awareness raising, data and statistics disaggregated on the basis of disability, inclusive education, living independently and in the community. So all those things, you can find connections to other human rights concepts, but they are configured in a unique way to address the specific barriers that people with disabilities face. Yeah, and this is the first time I've actually done this exercise in this way, because I'm really obsessed with the preamble now. And I have put up here on our wall, we're starting to fill out this wall of disability rights. So I've put up a couple of, highlighted some of the different preambular paragraphs that we've read. Now, first question, you've just read the preamble of this treaty. It's the longest preamble of any human rights treaty. It was, some of these paragraphs were hard fought for various reasons. So a couple things on the preamble. In international law terms, right, it is part of the treaty, but it's the beginning. It's a preamble. So it's not the operative part of the treaty, right? It doesn't set out obligations, and you can just see that by the language. It's recalling, it's recognizing, it's reaffirming. However, that doesn't mean it's irrelevant in legal terms, because very often, to interpret a treaty, we have to look to the preamble, because the preamble is often used to figure out the object and the purpose of the treaty. And this treaty, there are certain parts of the preamble that are incredibly important, and that are, very often cited. And I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing that the preamble does is it tells a history. It tells a story. It tells a story of neglect, right? It tells a story, though, of the history of human rights, right? It refers to the UN Charter and then the two covenant, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then the covenants, and then it has this long list of treaties in D, in paragraph D. It also, in C, talks about the interdependence, interrelationship between rights. We talked about that yesterday. And note that that's referenced here in paragraph C. And again, that's important, really important language. That language comes from the Vienna Declaration of Human Rights. In the 1990s, the world community got together for a big world conference on human rights, and one of the most important paragraphs to come out of that declaration is reflected right here in paragraph C. Again, this idea that rights are unified, we're not going to pick and choose, or we're not going to separate different categories. So that's in there, and that's performing an important function, reminding us that to understand disability rights, we have to look at, all human rights, not just one or another, right? E is important. We talked about it yesterday. We even looked at the language yesterday. That reflects the social model of disability. So that's probably one of the most important contributions of this preamble is paragraph E that says disability is an evolving concept, and it results between the interaction between persons with impairments and environmental barriers. So that is shifting away from these traditional charity, individual, or medical models of disability and looking at the barriers in society that must be addressed. okay? You'll see paragraphs F talks about some of the earlier disability-specific documents, not treaties, but documents that were adopted at the international level that address persons with disabilities, and those are important: World Program of Action and the Standard Rules. What's really interesting about that paragraph is what it does not include. Typically, a treaty will set out the whole history. Like anything that dealt with disability, it's going to be, in there. Not so in this treaty, because it was recognized that some of those early documents reflected not what we want, right? I mentioned them yesterday. The Declaration on, mentally retarded persons, a couple of other declarations that are really now very outdated. Important for their time, but outdated, okay? So, and there was a lot of, arguing about what should and shouldn't be included. So that was an interesting debate. G, I like the preamble G about importance of mainstreaming disability issues as an integral part of relevant strategies of sustainable development. So that's really about ensuring that people with disabilities are included in international development as beneficiaries, as participants, as experts, as implementers. You're going to learn more about sustainable development and the sustainable development goals. Because a good friend of mine is coming down here in February, Charlotte McLean and Lapo from the World Bank. She was a South African Human Rights Commissioner initially during the drafting of the treaty. Then she became, she's both South African and American, and she became President Obama's disability coordinator at USAID, and now she's back at the World Bank. And she's going to talk quite a lot about sustainable development. So you can really surprise her by saying, well, that preamble G, how do you think that relates to SDGs? Okay. A few other things, we see some of the things we talked about yesterday. Diversity of persons with disabilities, that's important. Not everyone is the same, not everyone has the same needs, there's great variation. And recognizing the need for those who require more intensive support. Persons with disabilities who may have multiple disabilities or may not be able to communicate. Had some examples yesterday, right? So that recognition is there. And then you'll also see references to particular subpopulations of persons with disability: children, women, girls. That was all considered really important. And then you'll see lots of the principles that we are going to talk about that are reflected in Article 3. They're referenced in the preamble, right? So you could do a little exercise, drawing from the different preambular paragraphs to different bits and pieces, not only of Article 3, but lots of other articles across the treaty where you see some of these key ideas reflected: non-discrimination, accessibility, and so on. Participation in decision-making, of course. And then I want to highlight for you paragraph U. Bearing in mind that conditions of peace and security based on full respect for purposes and principles contained in the Charter of the UN and the observance of applicable human rights instruments are indispensable for the full protection of persons with disabilities, in particular during armed conflicts and foreign occupation. I mean, this doesn't seem very controversial, right? There are refugees with disabilities. There are persons with disabilities who may face particular barriers in situations of risk, right? Well, this paragraph was controversial for my country in particular. So controversial it was. And remember, the preamble, not part of the operative part of the treaty, it's a preamble, right? But in the last session of the ad hoc committee, the body that was negotiating this treaty, the United States forced a vote on that paragraph. Any ideas as to why the United States and just a few other countries might not like that preambular paragraph? Oh, well, that's a good one. Okay. Because we would have to accept, because it has implications for refugees and accepting people into our country. But, yeah, and this was during the time of Bush. That's a very logical reason, and it's probably part of that. Any other thoughts? Right, yeah, the United States involved in lots of armed conflict, and at the time, we were in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. But the really offensive language was the reference to foreign occupation. Very unhappy language for Israel because of Palestine, and then because the United States at the time was in Iraq and also Afghanistan. So it was that reference to foreign occupation. So often when we're drafting treaties at the UN, all sorts of political issues come up in the most, unexpected places, right? So we had to move to a different conference room because the conference room where this treaty was negotiated did not have a voting mechanism. So hundreds of people, this is the last day, the last hour of this treaty process. Lots of persons with disabilities using different assistive devices. I mean, it was not easy to move into another room, but that's what we had to do. And the interpreters were kind enough to stay beyond their contractually bound time. I mean, that was volunteer. And we did that. The United States got the vote. Of course, it didn't make any difference. Nobody really cared about that language. And then the treaty, was adopted now by everyone. But we tried to get that little bit out of the treaty. So the point is that preambles tell a story about the negotiation of the treaty. They tell a story about the concepts and the principles that were important, and they tell a story about the history of some of the documents that came before. So they do tell a nice story. So we're building our wall. We've started with the preamble. Okay? Then we move to probably my favorite part of the treaty, and that is the introductory articles. And we've already read Article 1. Article 1 sets out the purpose of the treaty. It also gives a sense in the second paragraph about who we're talking about. Remember I talked about yesterday that defining disability was not something that was possible. There's no universal definition, but countries said we need some baseline, something, some starting point. So you'll see in the second paragraph of Article 1 that sense of who we're talking about in this particular treaty, and it's broad. It's persons with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, sensory disability. And then there's that kind of reference back to barriers in society. So it's supposed to really reflect the social model. Okay, so that's Article 1, and then we get from Articles 2 to Article 9. Article 2 is a definitions article. It's got some definitions in there that are really important. Right? Discrimination. What is discrimination on the basis of disability? Never been defined previously in human rights law. What is reasonable accommodation? What is communication? How do we understand those terms in this treaty? What's universal design? What is language? Language is not only spoken language, it's signed languages and other forms of non-spoken language. Right? Communication is very broadly defined. Okay, so all of those are important. And then we get to Sharda's favorite article. I think it's probably my favorite article as well. Article 3, the general principles. So, we've looked at the preamble. We know what that's for, its purpose. It helps us understand the object and purpose of the treaty itself. It's introductory. Then we get to these introductory articles in here. And then we move down to the specific articles, 10 through 20. Those are the specific rights. Right to life, right to education, right to participate in culture, sport, and play, freedom from torture. And then we come to monitoring and implementation. And then at the bottom here, we have final provisions that are kind of technical, but they're pretty important because without final provisions, you really don't have a treaty. Okay? So we're going to spend some time talking about Articles 1 through 9, and starting really with the general principles because they house really the most important concepts in the treaty. So, we have already gone through the fact that we've got some existing standards important. We already know that. We've looked at the preamble, which referenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the two covenants of 1966, and then all those other treaties, all those specific treaties that were needed to elevate and amplify specific issues that were not really being properly addressed, whether racial discrimination, children, and so on. There are also regional human rights treaties, right? So you are in the Inter-American System of Human Rights. You have regional human rights treaties, you have a commission, and you have an Inter-American Court that sits in Costa Rica. And there is a non-discrimination convention specifically addressing disability in the Inter-American System. That actually was adopted well before the CRPD. It's not as broad as the CRPD, but it's a useful document. It's a legally binding treaty. And other treaties. And then you've got those non-binding instruments that I talked about that are reflected in the preamble, the standard rules, but this 1991 Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness and the Improvement of Mental Health Care. Not mentioned in the preamble, not mentioned in this treaty, highly controversial, considered very outmoded. It's got some protections, but it's very medical model and was very controversial, especially for those members of the community of psychiatric survivors and consumers. So the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry was very active in the process. They don't like those MI principles. They're not referenced. NGOs can be very powerful voices, even in a treaty process where NGOs don't have a vote. So rationale for a treaty, I think we've gone through that, right? We needed to elevate and amplify the rights of persons with disabilities, even in the human rights system, even within mainstream human rights organizations. I'm on the board of Amnesty International USA, and let me tell you, we have a lot of work to do to educate Amnesty, a global human rights movement, about the rights of persons with disabilities. So we needed this treaty for a whole lot of reasons, not only for governments, but also for mainstream human rights organizations. Here's a picture of a very crowded room of NGO activists, disability activists at the UN very early on in the process, where we still were meeting in a little side room. At the beginning of the process, there were maybe 30 representatives of NGOs. By the end, there were over 800 representatives registered to participate in the process, and we were able to move our meetings to the main conference room because, as you can see, we really weren't fitting into the room. Many of the folks in that room are still very, very active. And some of them are members of the committee. So that's a flavor for what it was like kind of early on. So just a very quick overview of the process. So there were 8 sessions held at the UN, starting in 2002, where our big job was to discuss why we needed this treaty and to overcome the doubters, the skeptics. And the skeptics were Europeans, Australians, of course the US, Canada, weren't super thrilled about a treaty, but we kind of got through to them. And then by 2003, the decision was made to go forward. And we figured out the process and then established a working group that consisted of 27 governments, 12 representatives from non-governmental organizations, primarily disability organizations, and then national human rights institutions. And then we got together and put together the first draft of the treaty in 2004. There's a picture of Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the time. Next to him in the middle, Ambassador Luis Gallegos, who was the first chair of this committee and was incredibly instrumental in pushing things along. I was with him a couple of weeks ago at this training I talked about at Special Olympics. He's still super active in this sector. A lot of the diplomats who came into this process knowing nothing about disability have become incredible champions. They are really proud of the work they did, and they should be. So Kofi Annan raised a pen that us advocates had made up. I think it said "Convention Yes." And one of the advocates gave him the pen as he walked into the conference hall, and he got up there, spoke for maybe 2 minutes, and then held up his pen and said, "Oh, all I can really say is Convention Yes." And that was a big moment. No state was going to get up after that and say, "Well, we don't want a treaty." So he was there for just 2 minutes, but it was important. His advocacy was very important. There's a photo. I look so much younger. So up on the upper left, that's me with my colleague Kathy Guernsey, who I actually emailed last night. I told her I was down here. She was my intern and then worked with me throughout the treaty process. She was then, subsequently, later during the Obama administration, she was appointed by President Obama as an assistant to the special advisor on disability rights. So she and Judy Heumann went to the State Department and served for about 8 years, pushing forward the treaty. I mean, they tried hard to get it ratified in the U.S. That didn't happen. But they've done a lot of great work around the world. There's the U.S. delegation, and they're an interesting group. The guy who was head of the delegation is a great lawyer, not happy that the U.S. was not super thrilled about the treaty during the negotiations. He's now at NATO. He's a legal advisor at NATO, and he continues to be a champion for disability rights. So what he's trying to do is to sensitize NATO around disability inclusion, because NATO has some policies on child protection. They have policies on gender and gender violence during armed conflict. And he's working to sensitize NATO around protection of persons with disabilities. So that's pretty cool. And then Stephanie Ordaleva, at the time, was at the State Department. She's blind and runs Women Enabled International. She now runs her own nonprofit. Then a couple of other delegations, Qatar and Serbia. So it really was the beginning of intensive work on these issue areas. So it was the process itself was really important. So yes, we have this treaty, but the process elevated disability rights issues on the international agenda, on the agenda of other international organizations that didn't have disability policies. UN agencies hadn't done much of anything. That this process has really changed that. You now have agencies, UN agencies, the European Commission, etc., looking at disability issues, hiring people with disabilities. So when I look back, yes, a lot needs to be done, tremendous amount needs to be done, but when I look back at where we started and how, you know, often I or any other of my colleagues were like the weird person in the room saying, think about disability issues, you know, and we were like, what is she talking about? How does that connect to this? That's no longer, we don't feel so much like the Martian in the room. But in some contexts we do, right? And in some contexts you will feel like that, right? So you have some ministries here that are sensitized on the issues that need to be pushed farther, but you'll have some ministries who would not understand why they ought to be part of an interministerial committee to advance disability rights issues. So you're going to have to be the Martian in the room explaining why. You know, and I was reading last night a beautiful, I think I did bring it. Social Sector Investment Program 2018 of your government here. It's a really useful document. There's bits and pieces on disability, and then there's lots of areas where my guess is they're missing disability issues, right? So there's a little section on persons with disabilities, talking about development of a national register, you know, but then there's other issue areas where very likely the linkage is not made. So think about persons living with HIV. What on earth does that have to do with disability? Well, we know from research that persons with disability are every bit as likely to be at risk for HIV, sometimes more, because they're disproportionately impacted by sexual violence, and also often missed in HIV education programs, either because of communication barriers or other reasons, right? So is that something the ministry has thought about? Are the HIV programs here reaching people with disabilities? That would be a question that I have. And just a range of other issues talking about various ministries, the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government. They have a disaster and emergency response program. They have ecosites management and so forth. They have environmental cleanup, beautification, and maintenance. Are they thinking about accessibility? Are there opportunities in renovation programs to ensure that accessibility concerns are built into that? So I think there's probably a great deal of education that needs to be done in especially some of these ministries that may not otherwise see themselves as relevant. Another one, but in some cases they're referenced. People with disabilities are referenced under the Utilities Assistance Program, the Ministry of Public Utilities. People with disabilities are referenced as a beneficiary category. So, you know, there's progress here, and there's also in this and other government documents probably opportunities for you to think about how the principles of this treaty can be used to better inform decision makers about that linkage, because you're going to have to draw those linkages and articulate them. It's not going to be immediately intuitive for a lot of people, okay? Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about CRPD content. We're going to continue to build our wall, right? We've talked about Article 1, purpose, and the definitions a little bit, Article 2. So the wall is getting stronger, Donald, President Trump. It's way better than any wall you're going to get. Okay. It's a legally binding treaty, right? That's the main point. It's legally binding. It's not a guideline. We wanted a legally binding treaty that would really push governments to do something. because the other things didn't really work that well. So we talked yesterday that this treaty represents a new paradigm, the social model of disability, right, versus other models, the medical model. And its content is comprehensive, covering civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And then it elaborates existing human rights in the context of disability. So it contextualizes disability. And we kept saying, well, it doesn't create new rights, it's not special rights. We had to say that to governments. We're not creating new rights or developing anything new. We're just saying how the existing obligations that you already have apply to people with disabilities. We had to say that. Otherwise, they don't want to sign on to all sorts of new things, right? But you know what? There's a lot of new things in there. Lots of things that are not really reflected in other treaties. That's why we needed the treaty. So there's lots of new things. It really develops human rights. It pushes the envelope. It kind of progressively develops human rights law in exciting ways, but we have to whisper that. We don't want to tell governments that's really what we're doing. They know, of course. But, so you have these provisions on accessibility, living independently and in the community, supported decision-making, the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation. We'll say more about that later. That is crucial. That you will discriminate if you don't provide reasonable accommodation to a person with a disability. Right? So if your restaurant is open to the public and it's not made accessible, and it's reasonably easy to do so, like to put in even a cheaply built, portable ramp, that's a failure to provide reasonable accommodation because it's reasonable. Right? Now, building an elevator might not be reasonable, but okay. Now, our wall exercise is supposed to get us thinking about the structure of the treaty. So just to review, we've got the preamble, we've got introductory articles, so we can say articles 1 and 2 are kind of a special type. I've lumped them together on our wall. And then we have articles of general application. What does that mean? Articles of general application. Well, those are articles that apply generally across the treaty. Those are articles that, states look at to find what their core obligations are, but then they look into the specific articles to figure out, well, what does this obligation mean in education or health or rehabilitation? So you've got general articles that are supposed to help you understand the rest of the treaty. That's probably why Sharda loves Article 3 so much, because it sets out these general principles that you can use in any conversation with government about a policy or a law, and with anyone who's trying to understand, well, political participation, what does that really mean? You can go back to the general principles and say, well, you need to provide an accessible way to vote. For example, you need to make sure women and men with disabilities can access whatever, healthcare, for example. And then you've got the implementation and monitoring measures, so Articles 31 to 40, and we've talked a bit about those, and we'll talk a little more, so everyone's clear about what they are. And then we've got the final articles that kind of bring everything together, that just basically, they're kind of technical, but it says, this is when this treaty is going to actually come into force, this is what you need to do to be a party, this is who can become a party to a treaty, and so on. So that's kind of that's the structure of the treaty. Any questions? Okay. So, We're going to go on and we're going to look at the famous Article 3, General Principles. I have a little summary of those. It's a little more detailed, as you'll see in your actual treaty text. There's more detail. But basically, this is a nice summary of these general principles that apply across the treaty. The first one is dignity, autonomy, independence, and choice. Pretty radical when you think about traditional approaches to disability. Very radical when you think about the traditional approaches to children with disabilities, you know, which is sort of placing children under guardianship often, or separating, segregating in either separate schools or even in separate institutions, orphanages, etc. So that's pretty radical. Non-discrimination, of course, is critical, and what's so critical about it in this treaty is not that it says people with disabilities should not be discriminated against, but that it also says reasonable accommodation is a requirement of non-discrimination, okay? Participation and inclusion, huge. People with disabilities have been left out of decision-making, so that's vital and important and necessary, and it's not enough to say, oh, you can participate. If you hold something in an inaccessible venue, or if you say that the deaf community, we want you to participate, come to our public consultation, but there's no sign language interpreter. That's not what this means. This means you have to take specific measures to facilitate participation and inclusion. And that's certainly in addition to existing international law, which kind of just says you can't discriminate. It doesn't kind of go that extra step that's needed to level the playing field. Respect for difference. This was language pushed by the current chairperson of the CRPD committee, Teresia Degene, a lawyer from Germany, who was born without arms. And she does things differently. She eats with her, with her feet. She cooks with her feet. She writes and uses her computer with her toes. She pushed for this article, or this particular provision, respect for difference and understanding diversity. Equality of opportunity, again, equalizing opportunities for all. Accessibility, for which there's another separate article that will look at equality between men and women, and then respect for the evolving capacity of children with disabilities, and that's, drawing from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This idea that we should respect the views of children, to the extent of their evolving capacity, we should facilitate participation and inclusion. So those are the general principles. And what I would like you all to do is work at your tables in a group format, and I'd like you to make these principles come alive with regard to a particular set of issues or issue in the convention. And let me explain what I mean by that. I don't expect you to do something quite this detailed, and you're not going to be able to read this because it's very little. But this slide shows a list of all of the general principles that we've just looked at, and it tries to relate those principles to a specific context, humanitarian emergencies, which is Article 11, situations of risk. So for example, for the first principle, dignity, autonomy, and independence, it says humanitarian workers must consider the impact of the emergency and response on physical, psychological, emotional, and social well-being of persons with disabilities and tailor their responses. Okay? Another one is participation and inclusion. Humanitarian workers must ensure that persons with disabilities are provided with meaningful opportunities to participate at all stages of emergency preparedness and response. and it goes on. Okay, so basically the idea, what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to show you on the next slide here, is, you know, you could do it in this chart format if you like, or your own format, but take each general principle, and I want you to apply it to a specific issue area. So take a look at Articles 10 through 30, and you can decide, I won't assign you. I'll let you be creative, because yesterday you were all very creative and you came up with different topic areas. So you can pick a topic from, you know, Article 10 through 30, or part of a, you know, topic, and try to think about how those principles can help inform that issue.
For the first one, dignity, autonomy, independence, and choice, we were saying the statement there would be the rights to have a choice to legal representation or sign language interpreters. Why we said that is because we know there are a lot of times persons would probably be like arrested or may have some legal matter going on, but sometimes the police deny them of that right to say, this is who I want to represent me. So we chose, that was our statement there. On non-discrimination, we were saying a right to be heard and not be dismissed. In the sense of when, this very, in the sense of some people when they go to the police based on an incident, something happens, because I'm a person with a disability, I may have a different type of disability, might be blind, deaf, or some mental disability that might exist. Sometimes the police are very dismissive. They are telling you nothing is wrong with you, you don't have a problem or something like that. So we're saying the person have a right to be heard, and they have, you know, I have a right for you not to dismiss me. Full and effective participation and inclusion, that's it? Right, participation and inclusion. We were saying additional effort, extra effort is needed for information. The explanation to that was police officers, even in prison and those things, sometimes they cannot communicate with persons who have a disability. Based on the type of disability you have, they may not be able to get information or stuff like that from you. And that results most of the times in incarceration for persons with disabilities. If you can't communicate with me, because we were discussing, you may stop somebody who is deaf or somebody who has another disability, again, a mental disability or something like that. And because the person not understanding what you are saying or can't hear you, the police would say, oh, you're just not taking him on, and you would be arrested. It happened many times before. And we are saying that the person, if officers are trained, these kind of things would not happen, because they would then ask, is it that the person not hearing? Are you deaf? Do you have some sort of disability? You know, so we were saying extra effort needed for information. The same thing we said, respect for differences. Training again is needed because of the dismissiveness of police officers, persons in social settings and the legal or the justice system. We hardly have lawyers or persons who understand rights of persons with disabilities. They will take the case, but they then have to go and do research or ask you, the person who is asking them to represent you, some of the, you know, what is your right here or whatever. So we're thinking that they need to be trained and be more up to speed with, I'm doing it right, right? Yeah, all right. So they need to be more up to speed and the rights of the persons with disability. Oh, she was telling me something that I forgot. So, accessibility, full access to the to buildings, what we were saying here, access to public spaces as well as modern technology used for statements. Because we're saying if a person who is blind go into, you want to make a statement, and you go into the police station or wherever you have to do the statement, they cannot read back their statement for themselves. But they don't put the statement in Braille. So probably you use modern technology to record it, like video record, and they can listen to it after to hear what it is. Or what else it was? Or you use the tape recorders so that they can listen to it as well. And we say the access to buildings. If a person is incarcerated, God forbid, in a wheelchair, how are they going to access the cells in the police stations or the cells in the prisons? Are the bathrooms, or are there provision for bathrooms or toilet facilities for persons who are in a wheelchair, or somebody who is blind? How are they going to be accommodated in the prison system using their cane? Is it that you have do you provide provision for that? So he's saying that accessibility needs to include all those things with access for justice. Respect for evolving capacity, we didn't do anything there. We were talking a lot. So we didn't do anything there. That's it. Equality between men and women. We were saying with equality between men and women, sometimes women do commit crimes as well. And oh, please, you're one of those women always right kind of thing. But women do commit crime as well. And sometimes it's really unfair that a man, and sometimes people with disabilities may do the crime because there are instances where children are abused by the persons who are their caretakers, and it may be by a brother or sister who also have a disability. But they treat men more harsh than women. So a man would have all these things coming down, and a woman will just get a slap on her wrist and say, oh, you're a caretaker, or you're a mommy, or you're a nurturer, or whatever. So they just give us the slap on the wrist as women, but a man gets it harsh. I think that's very unfair. Same equal treatment for both across the board. And I think that was equal to opportunities. We did that? Yeah, well, that's it.
All right. Well, we were not as detailed as the last group. We chose we focused on dignity, autonomy, and independence and choice as our general principle, and we applied it to Article 21. We applied it to Article 21, which speaks to freedom of expression and opinion and access to information. And for us, we recognize that persons have different ways in which they communicate as well as access information. And so we must always make sure that they are able to have access to different modes, be able to communicate in different modes as well as access information in different modes, and recognize their preferred mode of communication, be it sign language or having to provide large print, assistive technologies, etc. And even for persons providing services in public spaces. This also applies to signage and services within the elevators, as I think we have here, where it would indicate when the door is opening, when it's closing, if it's going up or down, etc. That these services need to be made available. We also recognize, though, that applying only one principle to the article pointed us back to the rest of the general principles, so that applicable to would be that of non-discrimination, issues of participation and inclusion, respect for difference, equality of opportunity and accessibility, all feed back into our application to the principle, to the Article 21. And we were also made aware of the fact that even with the use of technology, in terms of the cell phones and the iPads, it can be very challenging for persons who are blind or visually impaired, because there's no tactile information available via the touch screen. And so all of that goes into even the design of both technology as well as indigenous services being provided. Yeah?
All right, thank you. Excellent. And I like where you went with that, and I like that basically your analysis then led you back to all of the other general principles. So I think it showed the interrelationship that we were talking about yesterday. Very well done. Now, okay, next group.
Okay, we focus on the general principles on Article 24. No, I don't need it. For dignity and autonomy and independence, we chose education, Article 24, which is education. The right to have a choice to choose where we want to go to school to be educated, from as small as preschool to tertiary education. We all have a right to have a choice to choose where we want to go. Discrimination, not to be excluded from general education system.
Participation and inclusion, we had a lot to say. Providing any barriers to be able to facilitate and support. Tools, what they require to cater to differences and differentiate the instructions. Well, participation and inclusion meaning that we able to have children for education system be able to participate in whatever they want to, and the inclusion meaning everything that accessible for them to use at school, meaning like how somebody who's blind, they have the braille, somebody who be able to use iPads and different stuff like that. Respect for difference, we have diversity, meaning everybody is different and we should be able to respect that we could do so many different things, that I am different from you and you are different from me. So we should be able to respect.
I just want to add, let me just some clarification for participation and inclusion. In the education system, usually we teach up one particular way. So in order for persons with disabilities to be included in the classroom, we need to differentiate instruction, meaning we use different means and methods in which to bring forward the information and also to assess their understanding of the information. So that is what was meant by that.
Great.
Okay? And when you say respect for differences, yes, we have persons who think differently and view things differently. So even if we teach us on a particular topic, each person will not see the same way, so you have to respect that. So you don't expect everybody to see have your viewpoint, okay? So that's
it goes back to the same way with participation and inclusion. We all learn a different way. So it's not just one way of learning, one way of teaching. There's different ways that we could teach and different way. Everybody learns a different way. Equality of opportunity. Have the right not to be refused, because we were having a discussion like when we have our kids at the age of primary school, going into primary school, where we would make an application to get into the school and your child will be refused from being accepted into the school. What's the reason why? We don't know. So we were having a little discussion as to, we as parents are the person to advocate for our children. Why was my child refused? What's the reason? And what do I do after that? Where do I go after that process?
We also spoke about, in reference to the convention, we have that as a tool to use so that they cannot refuse a child with disability from attending any school at any level.
Accessibility means the accommodation, facilitating peer support, mentoring, training, professionals, the different occupational, physical, basic teachers, learning, as we said, not able to teach one way, but different ways. Accessibility, as they said, like wheelchair access for children who sit in a wheelchair, in their classrooms, outside playing, playgrounds, accessibility. And
occupational therapy. It's spoken about professional training, professionals, right, and staff. So we looked at occupational therapy, the psychiatrists. Every person that particular child needs should be included there. When it comes to accessibility, they shouldn't have to pay for an occupational therapist.
Right.
They should get it free, because that is what the treaty and the convention and everything is saying, that it should be included.
It should be able to be accessible for all, because if it's accessible for me, who doesn't have a disability, why isn't it accessible for you who has one? Equality between men and women, as our friend was saying, different crimes go, but for boys and girls, it should be same across the board. Equality for all our children, all our kids should be able to be included in whatever programs that we have, not just because I could walk and talk that I am only being able to access this, but I who have a disability should be able to be a part of each and every program. respect for evolving capacity of children, developmental by persons with disabilities of their personalities, talents, and creativity, as well as their mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. I have the potential that I could do anything. I could stand here and I could talk just like you. She could stand here and she could do something else. She could sing. So we all have the potential, the capacity to do anything that we want to do. So,
Excellent, thank you. And I like where you went with that, and you, looks like you were tying the principles to different parts of Article 24. I think that was a really nice addition. Yeah.
Okay, so the principle that the article, sorry, that we decided to cover is Article 30, which is participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, and sport. And with respect to the principles of dignity, autonomy, independence, choice, simply the ability to participate would improve those aspects for children with disabilities. But we wanted to point out two areas that we discussed, which is the opportunity to request services anonymously. So you may have a play or music festival or something similar to that, and they may have sign language interpreters available. However, you may need to request that. And that, in our minds, takes away a little bit from the dignity of the person, because they have to then point out, I am disabled, I need this assistance in order to receive it. So the option of maybe requesting it anonymously. Movie Town, for those who are not familiar, actually have the option of the hearing headsets. I really have no idea how it works. But also you do have the option of purchasing tickets online for Movie Town. So maybe that could also be connected, that if I purchase my tickets online, I can request that, and when I go in and I present my tickets, it's given to me through the system. We wanted to mention the Kodo Music Festival, which improves the dignity of individuals, gives them that choice, improves their independence. The next principle of non-discrimination. So one of the things we discussed was, are special needs teams always necessary? And a personal example for me, when I was first looking to register my son for karate, one of the organizations that I went to, simply because I told them he is high functioning autistic, I told them he has low muscle core coordination, they wanted to place him with other special needs children. And my thing was, I didn't have an issue necessarily, but you had not even seen him as yet. You hadn't even seen what he was capable of, and you wanted to segregate him. In some instances, it may not be necessary. We ended up going to another place, and he was with everyone else. He went up as far as green belts, and then he got bored and decided he didn't want to do this anymore. And that definitely shows a respect for difference, that this other organization was willing to simply accept him as is and work with him as part of the larger group. Participation. So two specific examples we wanted to raise were, again, performances in Kodo's Music Festival, where children, adults as well with disabilities, are allowed to represent in this festival. Earlier this year, some of you may be aware, at the launch of the Autism Awareness Month at President's House, one of the featured addresses was by a 13-year-old who is on the spectrum, very, very articulate gentleman, and he did the feature address. So that ability to participate and to set the example. Respect for difference. So what we also discussed is the fact that inclusion is important, but also noting that certain activities can be better appreciated in a separate environment. So this is a specific example. I ran out of space to write. Movie Town, in April, usually for Autism Awareness Month, they've teamed with Right Start for Autism, and they do a sensory movie where the lights are on, the noise is reduced, kids can get up, they can laugh, they can go and touch the screen if they want, they can interact in any way. For a lot of kids, that is their only outing because they cannot attend a regular movie. And so in this instance, there is a degree of exclusion perhaps, but it's also catering to the individuals who really cannot tolerate the other aspect. There's also an aspect of inclusion because any child who wants to go to that day can go, by the way. I take like my niece and my nephew and they are regular. Okay. Equality of opportunity. Again, an example that we wanted to raise. So the right to creative output, the right for the person with the disability to be in control of whatever the outlet is, whether it be music, drama, art, or so forth. And the example was Autistic Society of Trinidad and Tobago for their t-shirt design. Was it this year or last year? This year. They have a very talented artist who is on the spectrum, whose mother is very instrumental in Autistic Society, and they decided to use that t-shirt design. And the thing is that if you don't point out to people that this person is on the spectrum, you will know he is a talented artist, regardless. Accessibility. So again, across the board, architecture, design, compliance, also looking at facilities resources. So facilities in terms of, do places have a sensory-friendly room where children who maybe need that escape can have somewhere to regroup? Resources, sign language, large print, etc. Equality between men and women, yeah, we were just at a loss with this one. I think, yeah, not specific to disabilities at least. And the last principle, respect for evolving capacity of children. So this example is not local. It's actually a sensory park in France, where they also have a cafeteria, other resources attached to the park. And it's run entirely by special needs individuals, persons with disabilities. When those individuals were growing up, some people may not have thought they had that ability, but they evolve. They have therapy, they have support, and they're able now to then impact their society in a positive manner.
We're building our wall. We've got our preamble, right? We've got some of these articles. We're going to go through a couple more. Article 1, 2, 3, Article 4 is important. Take a look at Article 4. It's called General Obligations. That's a really important article for governments, okay? Because what that does is it lays out the key general obligations that states, have to do. And let's figure out where Trinidad is with this, right? Trinidad has ratified the convention. So that has kicked in the obligation to adopt all appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures for implementation. And it means, Article 4. Article 4, general obligations, right? So you need to make sure your law and policy framework is in place, right? And we know that there are things underway. The Ministry of Social Development is drafting a new disability policy, and they're trying to align it with the convention, right? This is good. It's going to be released, we understand, fairly soon. Also supposed to take measures, including legislation, to review your existing law and amend it or adopt other laws. Now, I understand we heard on Thursday from the representatives of the Attorney General's office that they are conducting what they have described as a comprehensive review of the legislation to see to what extent it conforms to this and to what extent it needs to be changed. Now, a lot of countries don't bother to do that after they ratify a treaty. So I'm excited to see that when it's released. That's a really important step. And we understand the Attorney General, and I don't know why this is, but the Attorney General has taken on this issue. Don't know why, but that's good. Right, so we're reviewing laws, etc. And then there's a whole range of other things in there. One I would point out to you is that Where is it? Yeah, so take a look at Article 4, Paragraph 3. This is important, and it links back to Article 3. In the development and implementation of legislation and policies to implement the present convention and in other decision-making processes concerning issues relating to persons with disabilities, states parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities, through their representative organizations. So that's where groups like CODO come into play. But the other thing that came to mind as you were all talking was, the idea of doing a lobbying day. So a joint advocacy initiative where you target some specific priorities and do, it could be around December 3rd or something like that. But think about doing planned strategic advocacy, a lobbying day, where you do all, spread out across different your target agencies and do some coordinated advocacy. Okay, so we're going to move. I'm going to just do a couple more slides to take us through our wall a little bit more. So, non-discrimination, we've said it's a general principle. It's also an article, Article 5 in the treaty, and it includes direct and indirect discrimination. Very often, disability discrimination is indirect. Okay, it is, the failure to place a ramp in a school, is that direct or indirect? It may be more indirect because you're saying everyone's welcome, come on in, but there's no ramp. That's the impact is it's actually discriminatory. A reasonable accommodation. This concept really important. It's defined in the convention in Article 2, and it says formal equality is not enough. It's not enough to say everyone's welcome. Use my website. Come to my swimming pool. Vote. Go ahead and go to the voting place. Well, there's no Braille ballot or there's no accessible ballot or whatever. So reasonable accommodation requires measures to ensure that persons with disabilities do have effective and equal access, right? Whether it's in education or sport or culture or health or any other. So reasonable accommodation, really important, and just like I said before, a core addition to this treaty. Accessibility, we've kind of gone through that. It's a principle, it's also an article, and it's also referenced, in various bits throughout the convention. And it's very broad. So it's access to physical environment, transport, information and communication, and as some of you indicated, information and communication technology as well. Government websites. Increasingly, we see services being provided through e-governance. Well, material needs to be accessible for blind persons who use screen readers, for example. It needs to be accessible so that people can easily navigate. The information needs to be in plain language. And so often we find that, as I think was demonstrated this morning, when, clearly this little teeny CRPD is not all that accessible, and then everyone kind of was preferring the larger format, right? So that is a great example, and it's a good argument to use, that when we make things more accessible to persons with disabilities, very often, we are really expanding accessibility for everyone, right? Ramps, we know, are useful for parents with children and buggies, or for people shopping, or for traveling people who have suitcases, right? So people need to be reminded of that accessibility enhances access for everyone. That we need to identify and eliminate obstacles. So governments, again, they need to plan and prioritize. They can't just sit back and do nothing, even if they are limited in resources And these measures apply across the board: roads, buildings, transport, indoor and outdoor facilities, etc. So accessibility is another big one, big general article that applies across the way. And then Article 8 on awareness raising, and we talked a lot about this yesterday. The idea that so often stigma, stereotyping leads to discrimination. And a lot of times it's just a lack of understanding. It's ignorance, it's a lack of understanding, it's fear, you know, we heard about a lot of that yesterday. So there is a specific article on awareness raising, campaigning. One thing I did not see when I was reading that social sector plan for 2018, I didn't see any focus on campaigning, awareness raising around disability issues. They seem to be focusing in part on this National Disability Register, and it seems that only 1,000 people have been put onto that register. Now, the population is over 1 million. Okay, almost 1.5 million people. You know, do your math, however many people with disabilities, a lot more than 1,000. Is that, you know, something to think about? Is that national registry, is it going to work? Are there other ways to, I don't know what the answer is, but there's lots of other things that need to be done. Okay. So that's kind of, I think we've pretty much canvassed. There's also specific articles on women and with disabilities, Article 6 and Article 7 on children with disabilities, and very simple ideas there. The idea that we need to integrate throughout the treaty and our understanding of the treaty and its implementation, we have to think about women and girls with disabilities. We need to think about children with disabilities, right? That's it. Those are simple, but those are really important. UNICEF pushed hard for the article on children with disabilities, so that organization could really have something to say, you know, we are following and we're helping to push this in their work with governments. So that helps them in their advocacy, and similarly, very strong women-led disability organizations from Korea pushed really hard for the inclusion of this separate article on women with disabilities. And again, for much the same reasons, that it reminds us to remember gender and gives a way to push governments. So I think we're doing a good job. I think we're building our wall. Take a look, starting at Article 41. Those are the final provisions from Article 41 onward. And yeah, so Article 49 says the text of the present convention shall be made available in accessible formats. And so that's the one I use. That provision is weirdly placed. It does not belong in the final provisions. The reason it appears in the final provisions is because it was forgotten while drafting, and the diplomat who was drafting the final provisions was told by the ambassador of New Zealand, can you just find a place for this article we forgot about in the final provisions? So that's why it's there. There's a somewhat similar provision in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it comes earlier in the Convention. Okay, so accessible formats, and I kind of did this same thing. How can I use the general principles, you know, to think about this article? So one of the things I thought was that providing accessible formats of the CRPD advances dignity, choice, and independence, because you should have a way to, you should be able to choose the format that you need to receive information, and that it is something, human dignity, to recognize people don't all need the same format. Independent, so allowing someone to access the material independently. So if my colleague Allison DeFranco has an electronic format of the convention, she can listen to it on her through her screen reading technology, and I don't need to read it to her. She sometimes, you know, I'm happy to read it to her, but she might want to do so independently and listen to it. Non-discrimination. So accessible formats are a way to provide reasonable accommodation. So remember, reasonable accommodation is part of the non-discrimination duty. So if someone says, hey, I need something in Braille, you know, that would be an accommodation to provide, for example, a copy in Braille. Participation and inclusion. Well, who designs an accessible format? Who decides? How do we know what is needed? We actually have to make sure that people with disabilities themselves communicate that. So if I'm thinking about designing an accessible format of this convention for a blind person, probably not a good idea for me to just decide on my own what's needed, because that might not be right. So people with disabilities, it seems to me, need to be obviously included in all of these processes, especially when it, you know, in accessible formats. Respect for difference. So difference is the way we receive information, and you've all said time and again throughout the last 2 days that, you know, we may access information differently, need to receive information differently. So that's the same with accessible, with formats of a human rights treaty. And I'm reminded of Kiki Nordstrom during the drafting of the treaty. She represented the World Blind Union. And she was involved in the entire process and frequently made interventions, oral interventions, you know, saying what was important and participating very, very actively. And typically what happens at the UN is a government may make a suggestion, a proposal, NGO may make a, you know, a suggestion, proposal, and then they'll submit a written document. You know, here's our written proposal. We, you know, please put this into the record. So one day Kiki made her oral proposal, and then she said, and I'm handing around, you know, my proposal, my draft language that I want put into the treaty. Oh, by the way, it's in Braille. If you need an accessible format, it will be available later in a couple of days. Right? So she was very funny. She made the point that, you know, throughout the process, she was waiting for her accessible format. And you know what? It's a real pain. So she really got the point across, and it was using humor can be so powerful. Equality of opportunity, no equal opportunity to information if you don't have access. That's kind of as good as I could do with that one. Accessibility, again, it's what this is all about. And if I want to kind of think more about what is an accessible format, because this provision is very brief, then I can go back to Article 9 on accessibility, and I can also look at Article 2, which defines communication and et cetera. So I might get further guidance if I look back. And then gender, I'm thinking about versions of the convention that might be in a picture format or a video format. And I want to see the voice of image of both men and women, children and boys with disabilities. So I want to think about gender. Infographics, that's a really big thing now. You know, so gender considerations are at work there, I think. And then children, there's lots of examples of child-friendly versions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and also the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Usually, if you want access to that kind of material, pretty much your best bet is to go to the UNICEF website, because they have supported, in many countries around the world, different child-friendly versions of different human rights treaties, especially the CRC and the CRPD. You know, they may have interesting videos and so forth up, so you can look for that material there. So, did I do an okay job? Okay. I already ate some candy. I confess, I gave myself some candy. All right, so I'll just pick out my Article 49 here. And the other final provisions aren't that relevant. It tells you things like what are the authentic languages for the treaty. Those are the languages that are considered official by the UN. When does the treaty enter into force? Typically, you need a certain number of states to ratify a treaty before it enters into force. It's 20 in this case. One interesting feature of this treaty is that it's open to states, any member of the UN, any state, but it's also open to regional integration organizations. Can anyone give me an example of a regional integration organization? CARICOM, yes. Now, the one particularly that we were really thinking about in this case was the only regional integration organization participating in the process, and that was the European Union. However, there's nothing to preclude other regional integration organizations from ratifying this treaty, so that's kind of interesting. And the European Union did ratify it. And it's a little complicated when you look at how that works with the European Union, because you have all the European countries also ratifying. But there's some areas where the European Union has competence, has powers, not over every single provision, but there are some very common European policies, and in those areas, that is where the convention governs European policy. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So we're going to keep working through this treaty. I have a few slides, and then we'll head right into another exercise. I need to update my computer. Okay. So national monitoring, this is going to bring us into the next part of the treaty, Articles 34 through 40. Okay? And we've kind of been talking a little bit about monitoring, and so I want to make sure everyone's clear on how this works. So we have a specific article, Article 33, on national monitoring. Okay, and so here's the thing. States need to establish a monitoring mechanism at the national level to oversee implementation of this treaty. Right? The states take on their obligations, but they need to be overseeing what they're doing, how they're doing, and so on. So that's the first part of this article. So the first step is they have to name a focal point, or more than one, within government to oversee implementation. And governments ratify treaties. So it's governments that need to oversee their own implementation, right? That makes sense. Now, in your case, Trinidad and Tobago, the focal point is really the Ministry of Social Development. That's really where, as I understand it, the focal point kind of on disability. Disability is a cross-cutting issue, but that ministry is kind of the focal point. The Attorney General's office has a big role to play in preparing a monitoring report, but it's kind of, everything kind of starts out of that Ministry of Social Development. The second, not requirement, but idea is for government to establish a mechanism to coordinate action across different government offices and sectors. So it's not a requirement, but it's a very strong suggestion. Why? Because, as we've been saying, disability is cross-cutting. It impacts everything. So what would be an example of, here in Trinidad and Tobago, such a mechanism, a coordinating mechanism? What's that? CODO? No? Yeah, government one. Right. The Interministerial Committee, that was functioning previously. And that there is a commitment, I think, to reestablish that. So that would that would be the example here. And one hopes that committee will be relaunched and it will help to coordinate action across different sectors. And composed of government, but very often composed of also civil society representatives. So as my understanding is there were maybe 4 seats for civil society representation on that committee, and I think the intention is that will continue. So that's something that CODA will have to think about, how to determine what individuals sit on that committee, and to make sure that those individuals have the the skill sets that will be required to operate. Now, establish an independent monitoring framework, right? So not government, but independent of government. And 94 or more countries around the world have independent national human rights commissions. Now, here you have the EOC, and that would be that entity under your legislation currently doesn't meet the requirements of independence for national human rights institutions. And I've talked to them the other day, and they said they are in the process of amending legislation so that it will basically be this kind of a body, a more independent national mechanism. And then that would be one option, would be for the monitoring function to take place within that, that entity. That's one option. There's other options. But it's good to be aware of that because that's an important function now that the treaty's been ratified. You definitely want some independent monitoring happening. But you also want whatever entity in question to have the capacity to do that. So a commitment to do some staffing, etc., I think would be important. So that's independent monitoring, and then you're not off the hook. As civil society, you have a role. Civil society, especially persons with disabilities and their representative organizations like CODO, involved and participates fully in all aspects of monitoring. So that's confers rights on civil society in a way, but also duties, right, to take on that role. And it's obviously critical for implementation to happen. But there's implications for government here, consulting. You gave the example of the national policy, the draft disability policy being circulated, open for comment. I've heard some critiques while I've been here about how, well, the government could do better in consulting. That's true anywhere, right? For sure. But making sure that you're at the table. And the very first decision ever taken by the ad hoc committee up at the UN, very first decision before really we even started talking about anything, was the decision to allow non-governmental organizations to participate in the process. Typically, at the time, a UN NGO participation was restricted to a handful of organizations that would have had a particular status already at the UN. Well, there was only a handful of disability organizations that had that kind of status. So the committee, we had to argue strongly for a whole special, procedure so that disability groups from around the world, other groups would be able to participate. And it's not a battle that you ever win. You keep fighting it, right? You keep fighting that battle. So participation in civil society on the monitoring side, very important. Okay, so that's Article 33. We're now going to move into the Article 34, kind of onward, and that's the really heart of the implementation and monitoring. That's where we talk about this treaty body, these treaty bodies that sit in Geneva, and they meet every once in a while, and they look at state reports, and then they write back to states, and then they invite states to come before them and basically defend their record on that particular treaty. So first, I'm going to talk about the committee. Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's the treaty body we're talking about. All the major treaties have them. And in the case of the Disability Treaty, there are now 18 members on that, on the committee. Okay, so it reviews state reports, it gives guidelines and advice on the content of the treaty or the interpretation of the treaty. So that's the committee. The other body that meets every year is the Conference of States Parties. And that's just any state that's is invited to, that's ratified the treaty, and others, including NGOs, meet in New York once a year to talk about issues relating to implementation. I know that Sharda participated in the Conference of States Parties last year. So civil society groups go, as well as governments. And it's a fabulous networking opportunity. It's an advocacy opportunity. And it's also where committee members are voted on. Okay, so there's an election held at the conference, as new members need to take their place before the committee. And I mentioned yesterday Robert Martin, the advocate from New Zealand, who is now on the committee. So he was elected at the Conference of States Parties last year to be a member of the CRPD committee, the treaty body. Here's a picture of a ratification ceremony where the government of Spain was depositing its fancy, beautifully leather-bound instrument of ratification. It's just a paper that's signed, that's indicating that they are taking on these obligations, and then that's stored in the depository, which is, for this treaty, the UN in New York. And so where are we now? So we have, I missed a couple of my favorite articles, but basically we've talked about monitoring. The other bit of this section of the treaty is Articles 31 and 32. So 31 is on data and statistics. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. So some requirements for governments to collect data on disability to facilitate implementation. So if you're talking about education and a government cannot tell you how many kids with disabilities are in schools, how many are graduating, etc., well, that is a problem. And then Article 32 is the article that talks about ensuring that development programs, we're talking about international development programs, programs funded by big donors or the World Bank or the United Nations or states, need to be inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. And that's been huge. Because imagine the money that is spent every year on international development projects, building schools, building hospitals, building health clinics, transport systems, roads, water and sanitation, not to mention programs on, combating violence against women, combating trafficking, promoting law reform, building courts, training judges, lawyers, you name it, and humanitarian assistance activities to provide relief after a natural disaster or to care for refugees. Imagine all of that, and imagine designing a program where you kind of don't think about accessibility or ensuring that persons with disabilities are reached. Think of an HIV/AIDS program or a malaria program or child immunization programs. And you're trying to eradicate poverty, and you're trying to develop responsibly. And you don't think about disability inclusion, and you're talking about at least 15% of the world's population, 80% of whom live in developing countries, and more often than not, persons with disabilities are living among the poorest of the poor. So you're not going to achieve your development goals. if you're not thinking about inclusion. So that, it's a little article with a few not all that impressive looking language, but it's hugely important. And it has led to the World Bank, as you're going to hear from Charlotte, in February, it's led to the World Bank taking on disability as a much bigger issue than it ever did before. It's led to donors, European Union, USAID, etc. It led to, the United States Embassy, for example, hosting me for one day, a couple days ago, so that I could talk with your government and advance this agenda that you're doing. So, that's really a big deal. A lot of work to do, but we have come leaps and bounds, really because of that little Article 32, which was rather contentious because donors don't like to be told anything about what they should do with their money. So it was a very, very, it was a tough one, but we succeeded in getting that done. So what I'd like to do now is go back to and do another exercise that gives you another opportunity to take a look at the treaty, in a different way. My directive to you is you're going to pick a different article from what you looked at previously, okay? And try to think about filling out, because you've got many that we haven't really covered. So try to think about choosing one that is not up here in yellow, okay? Or maybe one that we haven't talked much about in the last couple days. I think that would be great. So here, I'm going to tell you which. So I want you to look at Part 4 of the manual, Section 1, and page 4, and it's a universal exercise called Making a Commitment to Promote the Human Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it's in Part 4, page 4. Okay, it's kind of in the middle of the big book. In the separate book, it's going to be in Part 4. No, not in there. Page 4. Yeah. Part 4. Okay. And it's making a commitment to promote the human rights of persons with disabilities. But here's what I need you to do. Okay. First of all, you're going to choose an article, between 10 and 30 that you haven't looked at before. Okay, that's the first step. Between 10 and 30. Okay? And I want you to, look at that article, have a discussion about it, and then I want you to go to the strategize part of this exercise. Okay, I want you to draft, a short action plan on your article. Okay? You're going to identify the actors and institutions that are responsible to ensure this right. You're going to consider what they can do to meet their responsibility and identify allies and resources to help. So you've done advocacy training with Steve Esty, so you have ideas about advocacy, right? You want to target your who you're trying to persuade and influence. You want to know what you're asking for, like in our role plays yesterday, what can be done. You're not going to just say, please implement the CRPD. That's not effective, right? You want to be specific and ask them to do concrete things, think about how they can be held accountable, and then identify allies. So basically, come up with a short advocacy plan after you have identified the article or the right you want to work on and have understood it, okay? And think obviously about this context. And I know you all, you have very specific examples of the issues and the barriers that people face, whether it's in dealing with police or, education or whatever. So think about what it is you want. And maybe it's something very specific, like, we want you to collect data on children with disabilities who are in schools and retaining, moving on to the next level or whatever. We want you to collect data here, so you can be very specific. Is that clear? And then everyone's going to present their action plan. Okay?
So our advocacy plan is focusing on Article 28, adequate standard of living and social protection. And we are going with Part C in this article, assistance from the state with disability, related expenses, training, counseling, financial assistance, and respite care. Our actors would be, our actors and our institutions would be one, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, and the Permanent Secretary. The institution would be the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. They will be the coordinating body. And then we have the Disability Affairs Unit Director, Minister in the Office of, Disability Affairs Unit Director in the Disability Affairs Unit, and they'll be involved in policy implementation. And then we have the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister and Permanent Secretary. The institution would be the Office of the Prime Minister, and they will ensure care and protection, which will the Children's Authority will fall under this ministry. They will ensure that young persons are not abused, right? Then we have the National Family Services, our institution, and the actor will be the director. They offer counseling. Then we have the Ministry of Community Development. Social Welfare Division, right? They will be responsible for cash transfers and the grants, which would include like the food cards and social welfare and that sort of thing. Then we have the Ministry of Community Development. They would be there to ensure training and counseling, and the Minister and Permanent Secretary would be the actor. Then we're looking at the Mediation Department and the NGO unit. The actors there would be the coordinator, and they would ensure community mediation services and funding. The second area is we're looking at who would be responsible, right? How would we hold them responsible, right? So accountability. We have alignment with ministry's strategic plan, so the development of action plans, and then we have the development of a shadow report by CODO, a civil society, of TNT's status of implementing the UNCRPD. And for our allies and resources, we have our self-advocates, which are very important. Their voice is very important, so we're using their voices in awareness campaigns, as well as meeting with the actors that we mentioned and the institutions above. And we also use personal stories to highlight standards of living of persons with disabilities. We're also going to be educating persons on the national policy and the UNCRPD, and awareness campaigns using different media, example, letters to the editor, social media like Facebook, etc. we chose work and employment. I have to read that. We did it together. So, okay, our first person would be Minister of Labour. They would have to get on board and organize, things for us. All the business chambers, Chamber of Commerce, the American, all the business organizations. There would be a lot of training and awareness to make them realize all the benefits of, the size of our population and the benefits of them. But we have to give them tax incentives, of course, so that they'd have an incentive to start this private sector. Okay, then the employment opportunity, equal opportunity employment. What's that called? EOC. Equal Opportunity Employment Organization. They would establish minimum standards of employment, establish penalties if the standards are not adhered to. We thought of small businesses, they may be willing to help because it's a smaller hands-on place so they could start. National Training Agency, they would have to get involved to train the persons who are going to be employed and also maybe job coaches or that sort of thing. OSHA, that would establish minimum standards of the physical environment to make sure everybody be safe. Corporate sponsorship, we thought to provide a lot of, we thought if they could do videos and awareness to really make everybody aware of how this could be happen and the positive benefits of the whole thing. Training videos. Central Statistical Office for data and statistics to know, well, how many people are being employed, how long they're employed for, all those statistics that would see if it's working or not. CODO and any other disability organizations would really have to get involved too because they're going to have to train, each disability is going to need different supports and that would all have to be said. Training on all those different areas would have to be done. For monitoring and guidance too, to make sure I know Autistic Society, we had this young man who was employed but didn't last so long because he didn't have the guidance, it was a misunderstanding, communication problem, it broke down and therefore he had to leave. So to make sure monitoring and that they are successful in their jobs. Unions and the Employers Consultative Association, they could all help to monitor, address any injustices, all supporting this venture. The lawyers, the Attorney General, all the lawyers to make sure that everybody's all the laws are being adhered to and it's all legal. And Human Resources Association of Trinidad and Tobago, again, for monitoring and acting upon grievances. So it's really going to be a big holistic, it's not just a huge across the board involvement of everybody. Awareness, training, support, monitoring, things like that.
So I'm going to talk about a scenario. We looked at a different slant. We were actually advocating for one person to be employed by the Ministry of Education. So what we did, we found out if there were laws that support, turn on face them. If there were laws that support employment for someone who is autistic, so we went and we got all the information. We went to the Attorney General, we went to the Human Resource of Trinidad and Tobago and all of that, and we made sure that all the laws were in place. And then we actually target the Ministry of Education to employ this person, and we sent out the application. The person was employed, and we made sure that the Ministry of Education, we had objectives. So our objectives were that the employer would accommodate persons with short breaks because it's an autistic person. He will let them be able to work at their own pace and accept their contributions no matter how small it is. Whoever, the Ministry of Education will do that. And then we look at the ministry making sure that the person have the tools because they are going to teach differently from someone else. So we look at tools like the computer, smart board, a projector. We looked at they may need a laptop and things like that because if it's a PE teacher, he may teach differently. He may use that smart board, he may use drawings, he may not be as active as someone else, right? Then we look at the follow-up plan. We would be calling to find out if the Ministry of Education is every 2 months, we'll be calling to check how the person is coping, if the environment is okay for that person who is working. If the person needs further training, we will also be in contact with the individual who is working to find out if they can cope, if they need further training, and what challenges they are facing in the job place with their colleagues and with the students in the school as well. We will look at the person joining the union so that they could be protected from any injustices and stuff like that. We also look at career advancement, if the person could be trained for career advancement so they could stay in the job and they could also, we know the writing is small, so you all bear with us, right? So we looked at all of that for the follow-up plan, the trade unions to be protected, and for the government to give an accountability of who, as the autistic person work, that they remain in their job. And this is our plan.
Okay, we are dealing with Article 8, awareness on raising objectives, make public awareness of the resources available and the organization who can provide support social, mentally, and physically to psychologically to parents for children with disability. Okay, this is when we say make public, meaning that we believe that everyone in the public needs to be open-minded concerning the people with disability, and they need to be aware of the different types of disability that is in society. Our action plan is creating a database type of disabilities, meaning that we have different types of disabilities like autism, CP, Down syndrome, the hearing impaired, the blind, etc., etc., etc. Services they provide, meaning that the services which provide could be from the social services, from the Ministry of Social Welfare and Development, contact, organize. What are these?
The action plan we're talking about. The action plan we're talking about for the types of disability. When we gather the information, we will be talking about the different associations that have or family support group, what services that support group will be providing for parents and the wider community, where the association meets or where they're located, and also the contact person and the hours of operation. So after you get your diagnosis, whatever your child has in the hospital, most likely we're saying that the average person at the hospital will be able to get this form. And most of us go to the health centers. When you sit down in the health center, instead of reading about diabetes and whatever, you will have information about the different disabilities that are prevalent in your country, because you may not know, even doing global developmental delay. And we're making the brochures distributed into the public. So we're looking at the hospitals, the supermarkets, anywhere you go, we're in your face. Our resources would be the local health centers, the district nurses, our board counselors we use in the area counselors because they love the photo up, so while we're doing stuff, we're using them. Your regular counselors in the Ministry of Social Development, where you have your mediation services, we'll be using them. Everybody goes to some form of worship, So all your worship centers, we in your face. Members of parliament and parents also will be self-advocates, because some of us who be working on this brochure, our numbers would be on the flyer also. And to make sure that the information is up to date, we'll be keeping, checking out, you have to update your information with us every 6 months. In case you change location, you change some of your services or you focus on that. So parents, so parents will be able to get that information. Right, that's it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Obviously, you didn't have a ton of time to create and do everything to do an action plan, but it got you thinking. You did a good job. This group here really was very detailed in your stakeholder mapping, so mapping those actors, that need to make it happen, and thinking about roles and responsibilities. I like the taking a holistic approach, and you've included monitoring, because an advocacy plan is nothing if you just kind of do it. And like my poor group in Morocco, they wrote a letter and then they just sat there. There was nothing after that. So monitoring, evaluating, adjusting, obviously, if things aren't working, you may have to adjust, and that's common, being flexible. Yeah, I like you've got to do research. You may have to do legal research. You may have to gather other types of information, and that's your first step in really educating yourselves and becoming experts on the particular issue. And you'll know more than any of the other actors you're working with, and you need to do that as a first step. And I like the supported employment model was really interesting. That's an important element of Article 27 is promoting supported employment. We all need support in employment, right? And there's some really interesting models of supported employment where people with more support needs are very successfully in jobs and working. My local grocery store actually does a really good job with supported employment. There's persons with disabilities who no longer have support persons. They're doing a beautiful job, and there's others who've been there, needing the support, and their support person is there, and customers have gotten really accustomed to that, and it's, positive experience. And an awareness raising one, too. So we are coming to the end of the day. Where have we been?
Just a question I just wanted to get your views on. Every so often you might hear of businesses, maybe coffee shops, etc., that are run solely by special needs, or they employ only special needs. So I'm just kind of on the fence about it, because on one hand, it's a great opportunity. You get them productive members of society. But then I also wonder, isn't it a form of exclusion? Because it's this shop that has all the special needs and the regular coffee shop hires these. So I just wanted your views on it.
That's a really great question. No, and there's no right or wrong answer. So I was in Cairo, and they had a Kentucky Fried Chicken establishment that was, all the workers were deaf people. Kind of interesting. And I did a conference a couple of years ago in Taiwan where they had started with a coffee shop. It's run, by persons with intellectual disability, with supports, but just what you're saying. And then that's evolved into what I thought was really interesting. It's evolved. There's now a bakery employed by persons with intellectual disabilities, and the head baker is an amazing trainer and facilitator and supporter. And what they've done, so it's separate, sort of the model you're talking about, but they've now opened their industrial kitchen to the community to give cooking lessons. So then so that was interesting, right? So there's also a big discussion, and we did this debate in the ad hoc committee, big discussion about segregated sheltered workshops, right? And that's a very controversial. Sheltered workshops where definitely segregated employment, but very typically not only segregated, but being paid lower wages to do the same work that might be done elsewhere, right? So that is clearly problematic and discrimination. Unfortunately, we have a huge issue in the United States, and it's a very complicated, not straightforward thing, my friends tell me, in terms of tackling that issue. So it's a web of regulations that provide tax relief to these organizations that have existed for many years. And so that is a real problem. And it's kind of, up to the community in question. I think those models can be really great in terms of awareness raising. But yeah, it's like, I can totally understand you're on the fence. I think I'm probably on the fence too. But, and typically you do see it's people with intellectual disabilities, although the deaf or KFC was kind of an interesting one. So usually people with intellectual disabilities where you're seeing in that kind of employment environment. So kind of thinking about your own cultural context, what's going to work? What is going to be the great vehicle to bring people with disabilities into good jobs, out into the community, playing a contributing role in society? That's kind of the question you have to struggle with, but that's a great question. So we've come a long way. We were talking yesterday, starting about the framing of disability. What's our starting point? We talked about social model framing and how that's been really important for for disability communities around the world, getting that shift in attitude about disability. And then shifting into a human rights framework has also been a big push to bring about changes in disability laws and policies. We talked about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It acknowledges children with disabilities, acknowledges that they may be subject to discrimination, and there's a separate article, right? But then we move to the CRPD, which is comprehensive, covers everyone, and really puts human rights in the context of disability. It doesn't cover everything, right? There's issues in there that are not covered. There are certain provisions that you'll see are very brief. Why is that? Probably an indication that there wasn't consensus to go much farther. Were human rights very settled? You don't see anything really contextualizing disability in the article prohibiting torture. It's just same article as in other treaties, right? Right to life, you don't see anything new there, but it's a guarantee of the right to life, right? So some of them are more detailed than others. We've looked at the structure of this treaty as well. We looked at the preamble that gives us a history, it gives us new concepts and ideas and challenges and kind of the rationale for the treaty. And we looked at the introductory articles, purpose, definition, general principles, and obligations, and some of the other introductory articles up to 9. And then we looked at the core rights, 10 through 30. We covered a lot of them, not all of them. So there's other good stuff in there. My favorite, one of my favorites, Article 29 on participation in political and public life. Love that. Love that. I want to come back and work with your election commission and all of you too, because I think you probably have work to do there. So we covered a lot of ground there. Then we went on, we talked a little bit about statistics, 31. We talked a little bit about international cooperation. You'll hear a lot more about that from Charlotte McLean. And we talked a little bit about monitoring. The committee, the national monitoring that has to happen, your role as civil society. And then we moved into the final provisions that kind of put it all together and make it happen. Now I have bad news, we're not finished. There's 2 more treaties that I have to tell you about, okay? Or you'll be mad at me. You didn't tell us about this. Okay, 2 more treaties. One It's good news, though. There is a treaty, another treaty that was adopted at the same time as the CRPD, and it's in your materials. It's called the Optional Protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I don't believe Trinidad has ratified it. And it's very simple. It's an optional protocol, so states can ratify it or not, and it gives some extra authority to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So for states that ratify it, individuals or organizations like CODO could submit a petition or a communication to the committee, kind of like a court case. It's a quasi-judicial process, alleging a violation. Now, you can't do that unless you first go through your national court process, but if you get no redress there, you could potentially take a case, a communication, it's called, to the CRPD committee. It also allows the CRPD committee to undertake a special inquiry if there's very serious abuses going on. So if you have serious abuses happening in a psychiatric hospital, for example. Pardon? Well, that would be, and there have been a bunch of cases, specific communications going to the CRPD committee about the mistreatment of people with psychosocial disabilities in psychiatric hospitals. There's a long and lurid history of that. It goes back to particularly Nazi Germany, but human rights organizations, mainstream human rights organizations, have a lot to answer for because they spent a lot of energy and time and resources documenting abuses against political prisoners held in psychiatric institutions, particularly during the time of the Soviet Union. Right? People held under terrible conditions. They ignored people who were held for non-political reasons because they were sick, right? So human rights guys, I can remind them of this. They have a lot to answer for. They need to be inclusive in their own work. So that's the optional protocol, right? It gives some extra quasi-judicial type powers. And it doesn't result in a binding court decision like a national court, but it results in recommendations, and governments don't like to be held to account. So, and there's been about, I don't know how many, 14 or so communications where the committee has come out with findings and recommendations to states. So that's the other treaty. Then the other one that you need to know about, your country hasn't ratified it. I talked about it the other day to kind of remind, because you've had this change in government and people forget. So that's the Marrakesh Treaty. Anyone heard of the Marrakesh Treaty? And that is the treaty for, it's called the VIP Treaty, for visually impaired and print disabled persons. It's a copyright treaty. It's very simple. The idea there is if I'm blind and I need, for example, an electronic copy of a textbook so that I can study history in university, there's not going to be a copyright issue. There's an exception, and I have access to that textbook in a format that I can access. And that's a huge issue, especially in education. People waiting months for their electronic version that they can access. So that's a huge problem, and that is supposed to take care of it. It's kind of sort of on the radar screen here, but it fell off the legislative agenda, I think, because there's been a change in government. So it's somewhere in the ether. And one of the gentlemen I met at the round table from one of the blind organizations seems to be on top of that and is pushing that agenda. But that's really important in terms of, and it's not only blind people or people who have low vision, it's also people like my friend Rosemary Case, who is paralyzed from the neck down. She uses a chin-operated wheelchair, and she uses a mouth stick. So a regular book's not that useful to her unless she has someone turning the pages. So again, electronic formats for people who are print disabled. Okay? All right, so we've now covered 4 treaties in 2 days. That's a lot. That's a lot of work that you've done, okay? You have the books to take with you if you like. Copies of the treaty as well, even though it's not the most accessible version. And I think, yeah, what I'd like to do now is I will congratulate you. And I would like to have a photo, when we do a photo, I have a present for Kodo that I brought. This is from the treaty process back in, I don't know, 2003. I dug this out of my closet. Yeah, and I do. Let's unveil. All right. Yeah, so a missing piece of the human rights puzzle. So this was one of our advocacy tools, and that really before we even had agreement for a treaty, we unveiled this and passed out those pens I talked about. So this is formally presented to Kodo, all the great work that you're doing, and for pushing things forward here and ensuring that disability is not a missing piece of the human rights puzzle here in Trinidad and Tobago, right? You're filling that puzzle piece in, okay? All right, thank you, everyone. Maybe we can get a photo of this. So, we get it, yeah, with that as well, yeah? Okay? Final words from anyone? Thank you, hands for all of you. Okay, great work. And I know it's a lot to do in 2 days, but I'm feeling the energy. And you really are making progress here, right? You are. Don't forget that. Progress is being made. The treaty's been ratified, and there's a push to do better on national legislation, national policy. You have the attention, at least, of some of the ministries, right? Others need to wake up a little bit, but you've got some process in place to do that. Figure out where your comparative advantage is, either as this group, this support network, or individually with the organizations you're working with. So, you know, together you can do great things, right? You're not going to transform things overnight, but you are sensitizing, you are creating awareness. It's a struggle, but it's a long one. So give yourselves a break. Thank yourselves. When good things happen, remember to thank people in the government too, even if, you know, they're a little clueless, that's okay. All right? And keep up the great work, and I will certainly see you again via Skype at some time. All right? And I hope to be back here as well. I expect to be back here at some point in 2018.